Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The world's two largest economies have just hit pause on their most volatile trade standoff in years. After 2 days of high-level negotiations in Geneva, the U.S. and China have agreed to a sweeping temporary rollback of punitive tariffs. Under the deal, the U.S. will lower its tariffs on Chinese imports from 145% to 30%, while China will cut its tariffs on American goods from 125% to just 10%. The joint statement outlines a 90-day window aimed at easing tensions and creating space for further talks. Framed as a gesture of mutual respect and continued communication, the deal signals that both sides recognize that prolonged tensions could further disrupt supply chains and pressure key allies. For a deeper analysis of the latest agreement, we invite Hannah Kim, Associate Professor at Seogang University GSIS. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me again.
And also joining us from Washington, D.C. is Jeff Moon, President of China Moon Industries, LLC, and former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's start a discussion first with Professor Kim to the joint statement right away. Both sides will drastically reduce tariffs for 90 days from 145 to 30 for the U.S. and for 125 to 10 for China. How should we interpret this move diplomatically? Do you think this reflects genuine de-escalation, or do you think it's simply a tactical pause?
It might be too early to say that this can reflect a genuine de-escalation of any sort. From what we've seen from the joint statement, we can see that both the United States and China have, in the very least, assessed this agreement positively. In that way, it could signal some type of diplomatic development, especially since both countries have shown a willingness to de-escalate tensions. And the Treasury Secretary also called these discussions, very productive. But at the same time, the trade imbalance between the two countries is a deeply rooted issue and a very long-standing one. It dates back at least to the Clinton administration, so it's not something that can be resolved through a single round of negotiations. Plus, this is just a 90-day tariff reduction agreement, meaning that more can happen afterwards. And already, citizens from both sides have been dealt rough blows. So, especially considering what we've seen for the past few months, this agreement should be interpreted more as a temporary patch agreed upon by both sides. President Trump has seen a decline in approval ratings due to domestic economic issues, in part because of the tariffs, but other reasons as well. And President Xi Jinping has also been dealing with continued conflict with the U.S. that hasn't, made him viewed very favorably. So this is a significant burden on him as well. So it seems as though both sides have to agree on a temporary pause at the moment. And it seems as though this is just like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. It just seems very temporary and just a pause for the moment.
Right. So it's still really early to determine at this point. Now, moving back to the joint statement, so a 115-point rollback on both sides. It's really unprecedented in terms of scale. Mr. Moon, from your perspective as a former trade negotiator, how significant is this massive tariff rollback on both sides? And do you think it's a structural breakthrough or, again, a temporary economic relief measure?
I agree with Professor Kim's observations and would add that this policy change, I think, reflects Trump's recognition of the limited effectiveness of tariffs as a trade tool. President Trump hopes that tariffs can solve all of his foreign policy problems, including trade abuses, currency manipulation, and even criminal problems like fentanyl. So with regard to China, he increased tariffs to the point that almost all bilateral trade stopped, a result that really served no one's purposes. And now he has pulled back to prevent the imminent disaster of massive unemployment, bankruptcies, inflation, and disruption in the global economy. These tariff reductions mean that Trump has now exhausted his tariff leverage against China, and he needs to turn to the heart of America's problem with China, which is Chinese industrial policies that disadvantage foreigners.
Right. But Mr. Moon, we are aware that this is just a 3-month deal, a 90-day cooling off window. what does this impact? How does this impact on supply chains, inflationary pressures, or investor confidence, especially given how disruptive tariff levels have become?
3 months is a relatively short amount of time, but the cooling off window, I think, will benefit global markets greatly. We've seen that stock markets are up, reflecting relief as well as optimism. On the ground, there's greater certainty that business can go forward. Canceled orders are likely to be reordered. Laid off workers in China will go back to work. Trans-Pacific shipping will resume. Key products will remain available to American consumers. And there will be stockpiling again before the expiration of the 90-day deadline. From a macro perspective, I think this development reduces the threat of inflation, but there are still major questions that are out there. It's not clear that all companies can absorb the tariffs at the 30% level that have been announced. A lot of folks in Washington think that trade gets prohibitive at about 60%. Citibank has published an estimate where they say that they think the global economy can absorb 20 to 25%. So this ability to absorb varies from sector to sector, company to company. I'm really worried about businesses and firms that are small businesses and those that have very low margins. They're especially vulnerable in this environment.
Right, it would be definitely deal a big blow to small businesses, of course. Now, going back to the statement again, this has emphasized mutual respect and also sustained communication. Professor Kim, in diplomatic language, this sometimes signals friction. What's your reading of the language used by both sides, and how much trust do you think really exists between the U.S. and China at this stage?
I think it's too early to say that trust has increased between the two governments. These terms, mutual respect and sustained communication, they can be interpreted in many different ways depending on who's using them and which governments are involved. But in many ways, phrases like mutual respect and sustained communication does signal the need for ongoing dialogue. It also can signal areas of disagreement. So even before this agreement started, China repeatedly emphasized that while dialogue with the U.S. remains open, it requires the U.S. to show respect towards China. Here we can see the term mutual respect being used. So, in fact, Beijing has made similar statements during the Biden administration, reflecting a consistent component of China's foreign policy principles, specifically one of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So, from China's perspective, mutual respect is essential for overcoming the current tensions in U.S.-China relations, but it also signals that this mutual respect is still insufficient. And on top of that, given that President Trump has made numerous tactical and inconsistent remarks in the past, China is naturally concerned that even if an agreement is reached, the U.S. might later shift its stance. So this concern is likely reflected when they're emphasizing the phrase sustained communication, right? The importance here is sustenance, but a lot of the times we have not really seen that. So from China's perspective, it can also signal that there are these points of conflict that need to be addressed. And this language may reflect attempts to de-escalate the current situation right now, but it can also indicate that significant efforts are going to be needed for continued dialogue and cooperation, especially since this agreement is temporary. This is something that they are continuing to monitor.
Right, so we really have to read in between the lines. Now, Professor Kim has mentioned, we know that the rollback is conditional, only lasting for 90 days, unless there will be further progress. Mr. Moon, what would you define as meaningful progress in that time? Also, and what are the risks of re-escalation as well?
First of all, I think that this 3-month pause will become permanent. The lesson to be learned from the last 3 months is that a total U.S.-China trade embargo has many downsides and no upsides. So I think that a return to 145% tariffs is neither feasible nor foreseeable. The Geneva meeting was the first U.S.-China engagement on trade issues, and progress achieved included identifying lead negotiators, committing to a formal trade negotiation process, and outlining some of the issues. In the next 90 days, Negotiators will identify more clearly issues for discussion. They'll probably create subgroups to facilitate parallel discussions as well. The hardest part will be addressing the industrial policy issues at the heart of the US-China dispute, especially China's non-tariff barriers. Those issues have been disputed for decades and are not likely to be resolved soon.
Right. So it's likely if this talks go through well, then the current status would be maintained. That's what you're saying, right?
Yes.
Now, in the joint statement, however, the fentanyl export issue and rare earth supply controls were not really explicitly mentioned. Do you think, should we infer that there were deferred or for future talks, or possibly addressed through, back channels?
We know that these issues were discussed in Geneva, but it's not clear why they were not referenced in the joint statement. The Chinese public security minister attended the talks, and the only possible reason for his presence was to discuss fentanyl. In fact, there was a fentanyl dialogue already underway during the Biden administration. Trump could have continued that process without any need to impose the 20% fentanyl tariffs. As far as I know, fentanyl did not even become a trade issue until about 3 weeks before the 2024 presidential election. Families of fentanyl victims who have suffered greatly and deserve U.S. government support filed a petition at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative seeking Section 301 tariffs against China for insufficient cooperation on fentanyl issues. Now, I'm not sure, but perhaps Trump's emphasis on this issue is a political statement in support of those families, as well perhaps as an effort to gain tariff leverage on China before the beginning of formal talks. What's clear, though, is that we're going to hear a lot more about both fentanyl and critical minerals as the 90-day pause plays itself out.
Right, so we will be able to get more information on that in the coming negotiations. Then, Professor Kim, for regional actors like us, South Korea, what are the strategic implications of this temporary U.S.-China de-escalation? And do you think it gives Seoul some space to maneuver, or does it increase pressure to, take sides in the months ahead?
I think like South Korea, many regional actors and many U.S. allies are, trying to maneuver and navigate the situation. It is difficult to predict with certainty, of course. So, on the one hand, the de-escalation in U.S.-China tensions may reduce the pressure on South Korea to choose between the two powers. That would create more maneuvering space for Seoul and help Seoul navigate the evolving global trade landscape, especially right now. And it not only gives South Korea a window to strengthen its diplomatic position, but it'll also allow Seoul to engage more assertively in regional forums and dialogues as well. So in that sense, it can be a positive aspect. The tariff reductions can also alleviate immediate pressures on exporters and allow Seoul to diversify its trade partnerships beyond the two countries and work with other countries. But also at the same time, it's also possible that President Trump's attention, as it shifts away from China, he may also intensify pressure on U.S. allies instead, including South Korea. So, personally, I find the former scenario a little bit more likely, but given Trump's highly unpredictable leadership style, it's hard to really give a definitive answer. And the temporary nature of the tariff reductions also means that South Korea must prepare for potential re-escalation. I'm hoping not. As Mr. Moon mentioned, I hope that this will not have come back, but still, countries do need to be prepared for what could potentially happen. So this entire tariff war has disrupted economic stability of many countries. And the fact that it's a temporary reduction, at least as of now, indicates that there may be more instability that may occur in the future.
Right, it definitely will deal a big blow, and we'll really have to keep close tabs on that. Now, Professor Kim, then now that we've seen the first phase of this large-scale tariff agreement, do you think this deal could become a model for how the Trump administration intends to manage major bilateral conflicts, short-term concessions for longer leverage?
I think one of the most consistent parts about the Trump administration is that it has been inconsistent. So it's very difficult to say whether or not this could be a pattern or something that we see or a model that continues on. But following the deal, Western outlets like the New York Times and The Economist were quick to point out the limitations of Trump's China policy. Now, in fact, just before negotiations, Trump posted on Truth Social saying 80% tariff on China seems right. But the outcome saw the US reducing tariffs far more significantly than that. So, in that sense, there's already a bit of inconsistency. And in addition to that, the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and USTR Representative Jameson Greer both stated that neither side wants decoupling. So, China, for its part, also pledged to further open its markets to the US. But this is a promise that China has been making since the 1990s. So in a sense, when it's faced with rising inflation and falling stock markets, Trump likely agreed to this temporary 90-day deal to buy time and assess whether China would follow through with concrete actions. So given the circumstances, it's hard to really see this as a sustainable model for how the Trump administration intends to manage major bilateral conflicts. And this will also depend on which countries these conflicts may occur with. But it seems just in general right now to be a pressured short-term fix.
Right. So we'll see if this pattern continues. Now, I've been emphasizing this before, but the latest move really looks like a very bold one, slashing tariffs from 145 to 30% in just one stroke. From a trade strategy perspective, Mr. Moon, what's the rationale behind such a deep cut? And do you think it's about restoring market function, sending a message to allies, or creating some leverage for next phase of the talks?
This was an existential decision. Trump had to ask himself whether he wanted U.S.-China trade to continue or not. He created conditions that made bilateral trade unprofitable, and only he could remove the barriers preventing trade from continuing. So he made the right decision to lower tariffs and allow business to proceed. The question I ask myself is, what did Trump gain from the drama he created, and was it worth it? I can't think of a single thing that Trump gained from the tariff war over the past 3 months, but there are plenty of stories of firms that have suffered severe damage. Trump changes course unpredictably and without notice, so there could be additional damage to come. He thinks that unpredictability is an advantage in the deal-making process, but the business community dreads uncertainty. So we know that the story is not over, but we can't necessarily predict what lies ahead.
Mm-hmm. A lot of damage definitely has been made to the business areas, and we'll have to see. But before we actually conclude our discussion, we are expecting actually a USTR delegation arriving in Seoul by next week. Professor Kim, what should South Korea be preparing for? And do you think this visit could mark the start of a wider effort to enforce trade discipline across allies, or signal a more coordinated approach to the U.S.-China rivalry moving forward?
So Trump is currently facing many domestic economic challenges. This has to do with the falling stock prices as well as rising inflation, among many others. So there is a significant decline in his approval ratings right now. Now, in addition, the ceasefire in the Russia-Ukraine war that he promised has yet to materialize. So he has few visible achievements to show. And as Mr. Moon mentioned, through this chaos, it's very difficult to figure out what advantages that he has gotten from this. So, in terms of his achievements, whether they're domestic or international, it's very difficult to find many of them. So now he finds himself in a need of a political win, even if it's just for domestic optics. So in this context, trade deals with allied countries could serve as a convenient accomplishment for him. And so, Trump has also recently mentioned the possibility of trade agreements with Japan, South Korea, and India. So in that sense, given the current domestic uncertainties in South Korea, I don't think there's no urgent reason to rush into a deal with the Trump administration. South Korea is already dealing with a lot of internal domestic turmoil. So it would help to have a more prudent approach and to watch how other countries' relationships with the United States evolve and respond accordingly to that.
Right. So observe and wait until we have a fixed administration to deal with the next negotiations. That would be definitely helpful. I'm afraid we'll have to end our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Kim and Mr. Moon. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.